surrender.
Song beautiful. As we read 1 Corinthians, and we've continued in 1 Corinthians for the past several weeks, and we'll look forward to a few more weeks, actually, as we read 1 Corinthians. Ken will be preaching next week, and then I'll follow on February 13th. And then we hear Beth Short on February 20th, which I'm excited about too. There's a temptation in this love passage, which is sometimes called Paul's ode to love. That is to speak in generalities about love, to romanticize perfect love, to idealize it, but that would miss Paul's point completely. I'll share a little story of a time when I was working in Buenos Aires, Argentina, right after undergrad. In fact, it was the day of graduation. A professor came up and said, "Adam, I think I have a job opportunity for you." And it just so happened to not only pan out, but be in South America. And so I moved to South America, and I can remember starting out and kind of figuring some of the ways of the church and meeting people, of course. And soon, probably, 4 weeks in to working there as a youth director at the time, I got a call from a visiting preacher who was coming to preach. And he asked me, he said, "Adam, would you be willing to sing a song?" Now, you may not know this, but I play guitar. Now, I don't play guitar, I kind of fiddle on guitar, I'm not very good at it, and of course, I don't think he knew that, but he asked, "Would you play guitar? I'd really like you to sing this Sunday that I'm preaching." And he was preaching on, of course, 1 Corinthians 13, the ode to love. So I tried my best, and the song that he wanted me to learn was written by Hal David, sung by Dionne Warwick, called "What the World Needs Now Is Love." Sweet love. So I can remember for 2 weeks prior, I was trying to learn the chords and pick them and sing them. I did my best. I picked a few things up, and then I remember I called the preacher back, and I said, "Preacher, I cannot sing this song. This isn't going to go the way you think it's going to go." And he said, "No, Adam, I really want you to do this. Would you do this for me, please?" So I said, "Okay, I'll do it." So at the end of the sermon, about the time that he was preaching, I don't remember much except that it went a long time. And I remember everybody was just ready for the thing to end. And then he introduced the song by saying, "Now, Adam is coming to share a song that he really wants to share with you all." It's a song special to his heart that he's bringing today. So I kind of tiptoed up the stage, had my guitar wrapped around me with the strap, and I looked out at everyone, and I sang, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." Now, I could not pick up anything else of the song except the chorus. I think I repeated it 3 times, and I think people were trying to help me along by singing with me. It was sort of a sweet moment, but I also saw that something fell flat. That we missed something about Paul's love chapter. We missed something in the Christian call of love as we were singing in generalities, in this sort of hopeful, idealistic tone of what the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's a beautiful sentiment, but that's what it was. It was a sentiment. And what Paul was writing was not a love song for the ages. Paul was dealing with hurting people, a broken community. He's dealing with neglected souls, internal fights, discord, power grabs, and people who sought after the spiritual things rather than the solid meat of human relationships that require one thing. That one thing is love. 1 Corinthians 13 is not a 21-year-old strumming a Dionne Warwick song or an ode to love at all. In fact, it's a call to action. As one scholar writes, this is an intervention, plain and simple. I know we've previously discussed some of the arguments in vogue at the time of Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. They were grappling with all kinds of issues among themselves. Issues of authority. Who had the authority, and by what means was authority given? One, of course, was demonstrating their authority or claim to it by their depth of spirituality, by acts of wisdom, which was of great rhetoric and bravado at the time, or teaching or even speaking in tongues, which was, for those who don't know, an alternative language, so to speak, in communion with the divine. And it's not to denigrate those things, but Paul certainly does put them into perspective. These claims through spiritual wisdom, teaching, tongues, these were markers of identity and authority and purpose within the Corinthian church. They were used to demonstrate one's spiritual value within the community. And frankly, Paul didn't take these away. He didn't say, no longer practice wisdom or teaching or exhortation or prophecy or tongues. He merely subordinated them to the virtue that, when lacking, somehow renders everything dull, renders everything hollow. Any gift or any expression of faith or act of contrition becomes, in a sense, void or meaningless without this one virtue that we call love. As Aaron read the scripture, a word without love is noise. Knowledge without love is senseless. Generosity without love has strings. It's like an instrument that's being played out of tune, or a tamale that you open up and it's hollow inside. There's no filling. Without love, everything else seems hollow. In the book entitled How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character, Paul Tough and a team of researchers attempt to peer beyond test scores and academics to see what it is that makes one student successful and another student wither. Through stories of teens, through stories of teachers, by following the links they also do between childhood stress and eventual life success, they uncover some surprising ways in which parents, teachers, churches, community groups do and don't prepare these children for adulthood. Through their work and research, scientists are seeing the links between early adversity and even trauma and how it can affect and even imprint on a child's brain. It can alter not only their physical development, cognitive development, but also their psychological development. This is a sort of trauma that happens in childhood poverty. They look at issues of poverty and how children deal with it, issues of hunger, lack of institutional support, conflict in family, constant moving, and how this adversity will either breed resilience or resentment. And what's the difference between the two? For Tough and his team of researchers, the difference is singular, and that is connection. In another word, love. If a child who experiences adversity, pain, or even trauma has a mother who can soothe their worries, listen to them, hold them, the child begins to discover that the trauma, that the adversity is not overwhelming, but it's something that can be overcome. When a child has a community of support, of love, a bubble in a sense, a child can endure much. Now, we've all known this. It seems rather simple, of course, that a mother's love can fix anything. But to what extent, we didn't quite know. And it's, of course, remarkable. For Tough and his team of researchers, it's a hopeful find that with support, with love, with connection, children who grow up even in the most painful of circumstances can go on to achieve amazing things. For children, for the church in Corinth, for you, for me, overcome conflict, to deal with setbacks, to live with loss, what do we need? To be surrounded, supported, seen, held, loved. Love is the expression of God in our midst. Love covers over a multitude of sins. Now, looking more specifically at the text this morning, we see how practical Paul's exhortations really are. Far from an ode or far from an idealistic expression of what love is, and though I do still love it in weddings, don't get me wrong. If you're about to get married, there's no reason to look past 1 Corinthians 13. But this is a practical exhortation, an intervention, as a scholar calls it. It's not an exhaustive list. Rather, it speaks directly to the struggles and misprioritizations of the Corinthian church. And I'll explain a little bit. Through verses 4 through 7, Paul offers what love does and doesn't do. There are 2 positive statements, strangely enough. Love is patient, love is kind. And then there are 6 negative statements of what love does not do. It's not prone to anger, it doesn't get rude, it doesn't get resentful. And all of these statements are in fact teeming with sarcasm. In a sense, Paul is being quite passive-aggressive in these sentiments. He's not speaking directly, he's sort of working around it, being a little passive, a little aggressive, a little uncomfortable. He's sort of saying, unlike you, Corinth, love is patience. In other words, it doesn't create the kind of toxic culture or environment that requires its leaders to send me letters while I'm traveling about. Paul's instructions are a bit like someone bringing a recipe of the same dish that you just prepared, saying, here's another take on that. I think you might like this one even better. For instance, he says, love is not envious. Previously, he has to address issues of jealousy and quarreling. He says, love isn't boastful or proud. Previously, they're vying for power. Love isn't arrogant. In Corinth, knowledge was bravado. Love is not rude, i.e., it makes sure to wait for the folks who are coming for the Lord's Supper, that they can eat as well before all the food is gone. Love does not insist on its own way. Previously, Paul writes, don't seek your own advantage. Love isn't irritable. I kind of think that one may be for Paul. So, don't get too irritable, Paul. Love is not resentful. There were those who say, I follow Apollos. I follow Paul. I follow Cephas. Love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, the man who found a home with his mother-in-law. The point that I'm trying to make in all of this, how specific it is that it's incredibly specific, and the list is far from exhaustive, but it's downright practical. One of the renowned marriage and family psychologists, John Gottman, wrote a book called The 7 Principles of Making Your Marriage Work. It's a keeper. It's a practical, not template, but of course instruction book. In his over 30 years of research and work with couples, he's come to find that there's one single characteristic in a couple's relationship that will define whether or not they will make it. In fact, this was his statistic, but he says that he can anticipate divorce by 81% of these couples will divorce if they demonstrate this one single characteristic. The characteristic? Would anybody, we could probably name a bunch, right? But it's escalation. Say, for instance, your partner brings up an issue, maybe even a touchy issue. Let's say, for instance, I wish we could go out. I hate that money is always an issue for us. The loved one, the partner who can return that comment by either matching their tone or even de-escalating the energy of their tone, has made a long-lasting relationship possible. Within safety, love can flourish. The one who decides to escalate the conversation, accuse, deny, debate, defend, wound, has literally shaped the future of their relationship. They have created an environment not of safety, but of eggshells. where your partner doesn't know how you're going to respond at any one moment. This sort of practical advice is not limited to marital relationships, but extends into the workplace. So let's get a little practical. A professor friend of mine shared the story with me recently of a student who in his class had the habit of sending testy emails. Very testy. In fact, it was after the very first class, the student sent an email to my friend, his professor, CCing the chair of the department, threatening a lawsuit for the way the professor introduced the class. Of course, there was nothing that warranted the email, nothing that warranted CCing the department chair or his tone, but the student had learned this behavior, there's no doubt, and he knew how to escalate. The professor, however, knew a different path. After receiving multiple emails that went from testy to downright threatening, the professor decided to change the way of communication. Instead of sending emails, he decided that he would meet with the student face to face. Now this was through Zoom, because it was during the pandemic, but still. As the professor sat face to face, nose to nose, bone to bone with the student, they were simply able to be human together. In the meetings, the student became a different person. No longer testy, accusatory, or threatening, the student became honest and reflective. And as they met together, the student even became a favorite of the professor's, and the professor became a favorite of his. In the safety, the student began to flourish as the professor taught the power of de-escalation to his student. Love, reflection, learning can happen. I believe we're learning some of these tools as a society. Whether it's in a classroom, or as a police officer encounters a neighborhood dispute, de-escalation works wonders. And I also want to offer that this message of love, this message of Christian love, is not a pie-in-the-sky idealistic word or hope. It's a real lived-in approach. It's practical. It's earthy. It's a here and now in the relationship stuff kind of Christian love that Paul sort of pushes and points us toward. You know, I find it increasingly interesting that the more I read Scripture, the more I'm realizing that it's not teaching me to be spiritual as much as it is teaching me to be human. It's teaching me to love, to see my neighbor not as other but as part of me, to see the world around me not as threat but as kin, to notice the imbued Spirit of God in each of you, in all of those around me, to hold each one, each thing as sacred. This is what it means to be in the heartbeat of God's incarnational love. To be spiritual often means to be more fully human. In Scripture, in 1 Corinthians, love is real. Love acts. Love responds. Love invests in who we are and how we are with one another. It's far from an ode. It's the bubble around a child. It's the support of a community. It's the relationship where one doesn't blow up at the other. It doesn't envy, but celebrates another's successes. This is the kind of love that we look for and that we dare to even practice. It creates environments of safety where people can be seen and loved. Love is the means to God's end. So for those who didn't grow up with a bubble around them as children, we acknowledge it, we grieve, we still believe that there's healing. For those who dealt with adversity exposed rather than covered and claimed, there's still healing. For those of you who grew up not safe to share your own anxieties, worries, or fears, May there be safety in community. May there be support. May there be unconditional love. Yes, church has its warts, but may this place too be a place of unconditional love. And for those who only know how to escalate, who have learned from their families how to raise tones and voices, whether it's at a coworker or a family member or a child, because they've never learned the way of de-escalation, still there is a more excellent way. There is growth. There is healing. There's a time to start anew. And for those of you who are practitioners, dealing with the trauma impressed on whether children or adults who, whether by neglect or lack of love, didn't grow up with the kind of support they needed. Don't give up your call or your course, because we need emotionally stable people in business, in government, in the workplace. We need you here, in this place. And for those of you who have had a bubble around them and know what it means to be covered and loved and claimed and respected, who operate in the freedom and the safety of a network and a family that loves unconditionally, well, we need more bubbles in our world. So what remains? Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these